The weird kid from across the street where I grew up had an extremely unwholesome obsession. Corny. That was his nickname. Connor Copperfield was a weird kid. We all thought so. He wore thick horn-rimmed glasses, corny as heck. He had fiery red scruffy hair and pallid skin, with more freckles than any fifth grader could count. We knew that because one day a bunch of fifth graders held him down and started counting. They got to 442 before they had to give up. I guess that's how far fifth graders can count. He was sort of my friend, though. Well, as close to a friend someone like Corny could have, I guess. Kids can be cruel like that. If one of the cooler kids has it in for you, you're basically an unwanted pariah until you hit puberty. Joel McKenna was our cool kid. He was in 7th grade and had a nose ring. Cool as heck, that nose ring. He didn't like Corny one bit. Well, except for as a punching bag. He quite enjoyed him then. Corny was tough, though. I'll give him that. He rarely flinched, never cried, and definitely never tattled. He was too smart for that. I think that's what fueled Joel's anger. Corny was just so much smarter than him, better than him in just about every conceivable way. I guess he realized already then that Corny most likely would grow up to become something special, while he would be stuck perpetually in some dead-end job. They were both wrong, though, as it turned out. There was something brewing inside that awkward, pale frame of Corny. I don't think anyone but me could see it, but it was definitely there. Some kind of darkness, I suppose, deep and potent. A repressed, burning hatred just begging for release. You wouldn't know it by looking at him, but the constant abuse from everyone was really eating him up inside, filling the void with seething detestation. I wish I could say I was a good friend, that I stood up for him, maybe helped him in some way, but truth be told, I did my best to avoid him. You see, I wasn't his friend by choice. It was more of a geographically forced friendship than anything. He lived right across the street from me. When you, as a kid, live across the street from another kid, and you are both the same age, you are forced to be friends. That's just the rules. At school, I'd hide from him when I could. If I was seen with him, it would be social suicide, and I'd be forced to join him as Joel's punching bag. I didn't want that, so I made sure to stay away from the places I knew he frequented, and surround myself with people I knew he didn't get along with. I was a shitty friend, I know, but I had my reasons. Well, I had a reason. He was freaking weird, man. I mean, really, really weird. The first time I realized just how weird Corny was, we were at his house. His mom was out that day. She was a single mother. I'm not sure what happened to his dad. I never heard Corny mention anything about his pops. We were playing in his room. They were pretty poor, so he didn't have a lot of toys, and I guess I sort of sat there in boredom, looking at this strange jar he had by his bed. When I shook it, I could hear a soft rustling, sort of like a maracas. I opened the lid to look at what was in it, when Corny snatched it away from me. "Don't touch that," he said angrily. "That's for Patches." "Who?" I asked. He'd never mentioned that name before. "Patches," he said. "She's my friend." I just shrugged and found a toy soldier to play with. After a while, Corny had to go to the toilet, and the moment he left, I quickly grabbed the jar, opened it, and peered into it curiously. I almost threw up because of the smell. The sight wasn't much prettier. It was nails and hair. Like a jar full of fingernails, toenails, patches, and strands of hair. I closed the lid and put the jar back, and got the hell out of there. The second time I realized just how weird Corny was, we were at my house. My mom forced me to invite him over, and I reluctantly agreed after she threatened to sell my Nintendo. We were sitting in my room, sort of awkwardly trying to figure out what to do, when he suddenly had to use the toilet. I don't know, I just found it strange. He had arrived minutes earlier. Surely he'd had plenty of opportunities to relieve himself before he came over. I followed him to the toilet and pretended to walk away. He didn't lock the door and stayed in there for quite some time. Far too long. I pressed my ear against the door, but I couldn't hear anything. What the heck was he doing in there? I stealthily opened the door and slowly stuck my head in. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled furiously. Look, I really don't want to be too graphic here, but if I hadn't been so upset, so angry, I would have projectile vomited all over the bathroom. Corny wasn't on the toilet. He was rummaging around in the trash next to the toilet. He'd brought a small plastic bag that he was filling up with stuff. Toenail clippings, sure. Strands of hair. My mom's used tampons. My baby brothers used diapers. And not only was he stealing our waste, he was smelling it too, and tasting it. Corny didn't stick around. He got this weird panicked expression and scuttered down the stairs like a scared rat. I think our forced friendship ended that day. He knew it was over. I definitely knew it was over. I wasn't going anywhere near him again. I wish I could say that the story ended there, but that's just the beginning, I'm afraid. The context, you could say. A few weeks after the incident, a fair amount of pets started going missing in the neighborhood. Mrs. Hutchinson's cat, Snowberry, suddenly disappeared. Dan the dog went missing without any trace. Hell, even our class pet parrot, Lenny, one day disappeared. We all thought somebody left the cage open, and he just flew out. There were few more disappearances. I just can't recall them all. The forest was a stone's throw away, and sure, you'd expect a few to fall prey to foxes and other woodland predators, but not dozens of them the same week. I immediately suspected Corny. I don't know why, but I guess it was the darkness I saw in him. That pure, unfiltered hate. Maybe something had snapped in him when I caught him doing whatever he was doing. I couldn't be sure, but he had been acting weird lately. Weirder than usual. And that's some extreme levels of weird. He hadn't been to school in a few days, and when I saw him, he was always either heading for or coming back from the forest. I told my mom about it, but she wouldn't hear of it. Connor was such a sweet and well-behaved boy, she'd just say, and then threaten to sell my PlayStation if I didn't stop being mean to him. More pets went missing the following weeks, and not just in our neighborhood. People from all over town were reporting their beloved cats and dogs and hamsters and bunnies missing, and our local store window was literally overflowing with crudely written posters begging for any information. But no one cared. Well, no one with authority cared, I should say. Probably foxes, they said, or badgers, or eagles, or any explanation that would keep them from actually doing something about it. I didn't have any pets. My mother had all the allergies ever invented, so I wasn't really affected, but a lot of my friends were totally devastated. So I told them who did it. Well, I told Joel. I wanted those cool credits badly. Connor "Corny" Copperfield took the pets. I don't think Joel really cared about the animals. He just wanted a reason to kick the shit out of Corny. Any old excuse would do, but stealing and possibly killing pets? That wasn't just an excuse. That was a call for justice, and justice would be served. There was a bunch of us present, and we were all questioned by the police a few days later. We gathered at the start of the forest trail, watching as Joel, adjusting his cool-as-heck nose ring nonchalantly, wandered into the forest after the badly injured Corny. Joel had beaten the shit out of him, and more than likely broken his ankle and his left arm. Both his eyes were blue and swollen shut, his glasses were shattered, and he was bleeding profusely from a deep cut on his scalp. He limped into the forest like a wounded animal with Joel in close pursuit. Look, I didn't enjoy it. In fact, I hated it. I know it was a shitty thing to do. Sure, I was mad at Corny for what he had done, but he didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to be chased into the forest like some freak outcast. That's the last we ever saw of Corny. And Joel, well, sort of. The police didn't know what the hell had happened. Big surprise, bunch of talentless, lazy hacks, the lot of them. They searched the forest front to back several times over, and teamed up with the volunteers. They kept it going for weeks. But there was nothing. No trace. No nothing. It was like they had vanished into thin air. The weirdest part, according to Sarah, the sheriff's daughter, was the dogs. The canine unit. They couldn't get them into the forest. They were too afraid. Even if they dragged them in there, they would do nothing except lie down and whimper. Something in that forest freaked them out, Sarah said, and her father didn't want to look into it. He was scared too, she said. Deathly afraid of what might be out there. Corny's mom moved soon after. I guess she couldn't stand the place anymore. Can't say I blame her. I, for one, will never return. Not after I saw Patches. It was a few years after the event. Sarah and I, yes, we became a thing, much to her father's dismay. We were walking her dog on the forest trail when it suddenly started acting strange. It sort of panicked, dragging Sarah away from the trees, whimpering like crazy. Sarah thought maybe it had stepped on something, but I could clearly see movement in the bushes further in. I told Sarah to stay back, as I went in to investigate. I could smell it before I could see it. I don't really like the term indescribable, but that's exactly what it was. I can't find the words to accurately describe the rank odor that attacked my nasal cavities. Death? Decomposition? A conglomeration of all smells vile and detestable. I had to stop and cover my nose, but couldn't help but to retch and cough. I guess it must have heard me, because the bushes suddenly stopped moving. I started edging closer, trying to stay as silent as I could. When I was maybe a few feet away from the bush, I accidentally stepped on a dry twig, and in an instant, Patches came out of hiding. It was big, about the size of a large dog. If the smell was indescribable, its appearance was too describable. I'm not sure what it was, or how it came to be, but I think I know where it all started. With that jar. I guess you could call it a mouth. A yawning chasm encircled by sharp toenail clippings and patches of thin, frizzy hair. It was centered on a bulging, amorphous mass, patched together by putrid, decomposing fragments of animal and human waste alike. Faces, blood, nails, strands of hair, patches of skin, snouts, paws, tails, all conjoined to form the abhorrent abomination before me. It moved by shifting its foul, disgusting internal liquids, adjusting its center of balance, and quite elegantly so. We sort of just stood there silently staring at each other. I don't even know if it had eyes, but it sure looked like it knew exactly where I was. I can never be certain about this, but I think I would have died that day if it wasn't for Sarah. Thankfully, she ignored my warnings and came looking for me, dragging the dog along with her. I guess Patches sensed it was outnumbered and slowly started retreating back into the bush. That's when I saw it. Something I'd recognize anywhere. A very cool-looking nose ring. It was still attached to Joel's nose, buried within a mass of shit and diapers and tampons. It was almost poetic. Patches slithered or crawled or rolled into the bush and sped out the other side with some haste. A thought occurred to me then. Corny. Was he still alive, roaming out there in the wilderness with his beloved pet, finally accepting his role as an outcast, a pariah? I got my answer moments later. It was the last I saw of Patches. I never went looking for it. Who the fuck in their right mind would? But just before it disappeared into the gloomy shadows of the forest, I spotted something. Covered by strands of hair and crooked toenail clippings, a patch of human skin with more freckles than any fifth grader could count. My friend was raised to know the exact date and time of her death. I only knew Michelle for a month, but it was truly a month to remember. I first met her when she was carving out my high school bully's eye with a butter knife, and we were more or less inseparable after that. She was a few years older than me, so of course I fell instantly in love, but I knew deep down we were destined for friendship and little else. I knew this deep down because she made it clear that she was going to die in roughly a month. Can't love a dead chick, she'd say. At first I thought it was just a clever way to avoid the awkwardness of turning me down, but at some point I came close to believing her. It was just something about her, something extremely free, careless and unconfined, refreshingly brave and outspoken and honest. When I met her, I was going through the most depressing period of my life. I was constantly bullied and belittled at school. My younger twin sisters were both hospitalized, each needing a transplant to survive. Jenna needed a heart, Chloe needed kidneys, and my parents had their hands full covering the medical expenses. I think we all in our own ways were on the verge of just giving up, of just letting go. I was saved by Michelle. I have no doubt about it. If she hadn't shown up when Brett was beating the shit out of me, I would have killed myself that day. I was just so sick of it, sick of the beating, sick of the abuse, sick of being alone. But Michelle came out of nowhere, threw him into the wall, knocked his nose halfway up his brain, and proceeded to dig out his left eye with the aforementioned cutlery. He never touched me again. You'd think she'd get into trouble after doing something like that, but it was never reported. Brett claimed it had been an accident, that he'd crashed with his moped. I think he feared that Michelle would kill him if he said otherwise. I, for one, have no doubt she would have. That was just who she was. Michelle never went to school. She said it was because she knew she was going to die. Why bother with bullshit like school then? No, she was all about enjoying life to the fullest, kicking assholes in the face, fucking over people who fucked over others. She wanted to leave this world a better place than she found it, and by her logic, this was done exclusively by ridding it of shitbags, one way or another. "How do you know you're gonna die?" I asked her once. "My parents tell me," she said, "every day, and they're good for their word." She wouldn't explain it in detail, just that she was raised knowing the exact date and time of her death, down to the very second, and that it was meant to be. That's what they told her. In death, her life would have meaning. At first, I didn't think much of it, you know. She was a crazy girl, and she always said weird stuff like that. I was kind of banking on it all being some bizarre joke or something, but when the month drew to a close, I was getting really worried it might all be true. I'd grown too attached to her. Every minute I wasn't at school or the hospital was spent with her, and the thought of losing her, my only friend, made me horribly depressed. That last week I was really on edge. The twins were in bad shape, and my parents were spending every waking minute at the hospital. They had yet to find any donor matches, and time was running out. It felt like my time was running out too. The dark thoughts were returning, and I started imagining how I would kill myself should Michelle ever leave me. I found it strange that she'd never invited me home. I mean, friends do that, right? Invite each other over. She'd been to our house several times. She even crashed on the couch a few times, and we would often watch movies there, raid my parents' liquor cabinet, get wasted, and generally just have fun. But I'd never been to her house. Not once. I didn't even know where she lived, so one night I just decided to follow her. What was there to lose, really? Maybe I could get some answers from her parents or something. Some way to explain why she was so convinced she was dying. Maybe they lied to her? Some sort of cult? A way to form her beliefs into accepting the unacceptable. A way to control her. I stalked her for 30 minutes, lurking in the shadows as she paced down the streets. When she headed to the outskirts, I started getting worried, and when she took the narrow trail through the forest, I was almost having a full-on panic attack. Where the hell was she heading? As far as I knew, there weren't any houses for miles. About halfway into the forest, I suddenly lost her. It was like she vanished without a trace. I walked back and forth, up and down, but there was just no sign of her at all. Eventually I had to give up and return home, my mind growing ever darker. I remember the last day like it was yesterday, every minute of it crisp and clear and vivid in my mind. Every scent, every sound, every muscle moving on her perfect face, all those smiles and kind words, everything. The last day came and went, but I didn't know it was the last day. If I'd known, I would have told her how much I cared for her, how much she meant to me, how much I owed her my life and sanity. Without her, I wouldn't be alive. But I didn't know, and I never told her. I hope she somehow realized it, that she could see it in my eyes and actions every day, but I can never be sure. She just acted so normal, you know. She was Michelle that day, too. Same carefree spirit, the same wild, devil-may-care attitude. We spent the afternoon smoking weed, watching silly cartoons, laughing, and just enjoying each other's company. But when she left, I knew something was up. I don't know how. I guess there was some detail, some little thing that alarmed me, but having replayed and analyzed that day over and over in my mind, I can't think of anything. Nothing. But I knew, so I followed her again. This time I stayed closer, always having her in my sights, always knowing exactly where she was. She was walking considerably slower that night, almost like she knew I was behind her. Almost like she wanted me to follow her. The air was cold and crisp, and whenever autumn draws close, I can step outside, take a deep breath, and relive the exact moment when she suddenly turned on her heels to face me. "This is it," she said. "This is the day I die." She walked over to me and handed me an envelope. It was light, but there was definitely something in it. A letter, perhaps. "You will need this," she stroked my hair gently. "When the time comes, you'll know what to do with it." "I don't understand," I said. "Please, let's just leave. Let's just get out of here." She smiled and kissed me on the cheek. If I concentrate real hard, I can still conjure up the smell of her perfume. "This is goodbye," she murmured softly, "but you will come to understand that it was always meant to be." I reached out to hug her when they emerged from the darkness. Two tall figures clad in dark robes, an old man and an elderly woman. their milky white hair flowing gently in the breeze. They had this solemn expression on their faces, the kind you'd see in funerals, an expression of acceptance to sorrow and despair because it is just a part of life. Michelle pushed me away forcefully, and by the time I'd regained my balance, it was already too late. Her throat had been slit from either side of her neck. A perfect cross, left to right, right to left. Blood was squirting out, coloring the dull brown of the roadside a deep shade of crimson. The robed couple swiftly stepped back into the shadows, leaving me desperately clutching the lifeless body of Michelle, screaming my lungs out, wailing like an animal into the cold night. The paramedics came 10 minutes later. I have no idea who called them. Anonymous, they later told me. She had no ID on her, so they asked me a bunch of questions. I didn't know the answer to any of them. She was Michelle. That was all I knew. Her name was Michelle. She was my friend, and she was the best person I'd ever met. They let me ride the ambulance to the hospital, but they quickly pronounced her dead. She'd lost too much blood, they told me. It wasn't my fault. There wasn't anything I could have done. This didn't offer me much comfort. I was devastated, totally broken, the dark thoughts resurfacing once again, this time with more power than ever before. "What's that in your hand?" One of the paramedics asked. "Does that belong to Michelle?" I glanced at the envelope. It was completely drenched in blood, much like me. And then it suddenly hit me. I don't know what it was, but it was like she told me, when the time comes, you'll know what to do with it. So without thinking, I just handed it over to him. He sort of held it up, like he'd somehow see through it if he got a better angle of it, before he gently opened it. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "I am better now. I still have problems understanding what happened, but I am better. I have come to terms with it, with the fact that everything happened just the way it was supposed to happen, and it has shaped me, shaped my life into what I am today. Michelle didn't just save me, she saved my entire family, every aspect of my life. And I guess you're wondering what was in that envelope. Maybe you'd figured it out, maybe not. It was a donor card, and as it turned out, she was a perfect match for my twin sisters. "Can't love a dead chick," she said. That's the only thing she was ever wrong about. I met my boyfriend's parents for the first time. Their dinner ritual left me horrified. I'd been dating Jason Myers for 2 months when he finally invited me to meet his parents. He'd been strangely reluctant to the idea, having met my parents on multiple occasions already, and I was really starting to get anxious about the whole thing. Was he embarrassed? Was I not good enough for his parents? But when he finally called and asked if I wanted to join him for dinner at his parents' house, I was over the moon. It meant that he took us seriously. I knew that his family had rather eclectic beliefs, some pagan mix of something or other, but Jason had always seemed like the poster boy for normality. Well, almost. He told me he didn't really practice the religion, but that he had deep respect for his parents who did, and he warned me before meeting them that they might be a bit different. I didn't mind different, though. Most of the time, I even welcomed it. I showed up a bit early, having left with more than enough time to locate the address. I wasn't very familiar in that part of town, and all the houses more or less looked identical to me. "Look for the stone," Jason said, which didn't make much sense until it suddenly did. I'd driven through the narrow streets several times, glancing left and right for any clues, when suddenly I saw it. It was massive, a dusky obelisk carved from what looked like obsidian. What a bizarre freaking garden ornament was all that I could think. I pulled up in the driveway, got out, and just stood there looking at the stone. It was extraordinary, sure, but it just looked so malplaced, like it belonged in the middle of Stonehenge or something. Engraved on its smooth, glass-like surface was a single tribal eye. "Penny!" Jason suddenly called from the front door. "You found it!" I smiled and walked over to him. I could see 2 figures crowding the doorway behind him, and as I approached, Jason stepped aside to let them through. "Penny," Jason said, "meet my parents. Mom, Dad, this is Penny." I smiled and reached out my hand awkwardly. Mr. Myers grabbed it firmly and gave it a rigorous shake. He was a tall, rugged, rather handsome man in his mid-50s. "Pleased to meet you, Penny," he smiled. "I'm Gerald. Jason's told us all about you." Mrs. Myers took my other hand and shook it gently. She looked thin and fragile, maybe a little bit older than Mr. Myers. I felt rather trapped standing there with a parent in either hand. At least they seemed welcoming. Too welcoming, one could even say. "I'm Vivian," she said. "So wonderful to finally meet you." I thanked them both and followed them inside. The house was nice, quite spacious, a normal family home by any standards. I tried to spot any abnormalities, like strange religious ornaments or iconography or some such, but everything looked perfectly dull and clean. "Dinner's almost ready," Mrs. Myers said, "so please just take a seat." The dinner table was set up beautifully, with candles and napkins folded like swans and all manner of lovely decorations. Jason pulled out a chair and beckoned for me to sit down in it. Mr. and Mrs. Myers disappeared into the kitchen, and I took Jason's hand and smiled. "They don't seem strange at all," I said. "Perfectly normal." "It's still early," he laughed. "Give it time." "By the way," I turned my gaze to the window, "what's the deal with the stone?" Before Jason had the chance to answer, Mr. and Mrs. Myers came back, hazardously balancing a few too many smoking hot pots and pans in their hands. "Please," I said, "let me help you." Mr. Myers chuckled and gracefully arranged the pots on the table with impressive speed and accuracy. "I used to work at a restaurant," he said, 30 years. "I've got some practice." Mr. and Mrs. Myers sat down opposite us and smiled a creepily identical smile. "So, Penny," Mr. Myers said, "Jason told us you work with computers?" "Yeah," I smiled. "Software, actually." "One of those eggheads, huh?" he chuckled. "I suppose that's a good occupation." "Maybe she could take a look at our printer?" Mrs. Myers chimed in. "That darn thing never seems to work." "Mom," Jason said, "she's not here for work. Leave her alone." "Oh, I'm sorry," she said. "You're quite right, of course. My apologies, Penny." "It's all right," I said. "I could maybe take a look at it later if you want me to." They both just kept smiling, silently staring at Jason and me, and at some point it became rather unnerving. Suddenly, Mr. Myers got up from his seat and walked over to a cabinet at the far end of the room. He opened a drawer and took something from it before returning to his seat. "We have to pray for the meal," Mr. Myers said. "But first, we need you to do something." I stared at him quizzically as he handed me an adhesive eye patch. My sister used to wear one as a kid to correct her lazy eye, but I just couldn't fathom why he wanted me to wear one now. "I know it might seem strange," Mr. Myers said, "but please humor us. Wear it over your left eye, and I will explain everything as we go along." Jason squeezed my hand gently and smiled, and I realized we were getting into the weird religion part of the evening. I shrugged slightly and took off the wrapper, carefully placing the eye patch over my left eye as instructed. "Wonderful," Mr. Myers said. "Let us remove the veil." I gasped in horror as they all, Jason included, grabbed their left eye in between thumb and index finger, yanked out the eyeball and placed it gently on the table. I knew Jason had an artificial eye, hence the almost normal, but I had no idea the entire family were missing an eye. "Now," Mr. Myers said, "let us join hands." Mr. Myers extended his arm across the table and I nervously did the same. When we were all joined, the three of them lifted their heads and just stared at the ceiling. Anxious and quite weirded out, I resolved to mimicking their behavior. I don't know how long we held that pose, but I'm guessing roughly 5 minutes. My hands were shaking and my neck felt strained when suddenly Mr. Myers started talking. I say talking, but that's not really what he did. It was like a deep, hoarse, croaking sound, like a frog was stuck in his throat and he was desperately trying to cough it up. I could see his neck bulging weirdly as the horrifying noises lowered and rose in pitch in mesmerizing patterns, almost like a shamanistic chant or something. Then, just as sudden as it had started, he stopped, and everyone lowered their heads and let go of each other's hands. "Now," Mr. Myers continued, "let us feed the unseeing eye." Mr. Myers lifted off the lid on one of the pots, and they each stuck a hand in there. I edged back in my seat uneasily as I realized what was in it. I'm not sure what animal it was from, but I recognize entrails when I see them. They were uncooked and bloody, the slippery, squelching, repulsive sounds of their hands greedily grabbing them, causing my stomach to churn. What happened next caused me to get up from my seat in horror and disgust. They were stuffing the bloody, dripping entrails into their empty eye sockets, really pushing them in there with their fingers and moaning creepily while doing so. I edged back until I reached the wall unable to take my eyes off the vile, ungodly ritual. They kept doing this until the pot was empty, before Mr. Myers put the lid back on and smiled in my direction. "Final part, Penny," he said. "Don't worry. I know this all might seem very strange to you." They all grabbed their eyes from the table and plopped them back in. I could still hear the horrible squelching sound of the entrails slithering around in there. If I didn't know better, I'd say it sounded exactly like someone chewing. I'm sorry," I stuttered. "I just remembered I have an appointment. I think I need to leave." I slowly edged from the wall towards the door, never once averting my gaze. I felt sick, repulsed, and utterly horrified. And I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Mr. Myers smiled. "I understand," he said. "We understand completely." He got up and walked to the cabinet again, opening another drawer, lifting from it a small cardboard box. "Take this," he said. "A parting gift. We are so glad you could join us, Penny. You are everything Jason said you'd be." I'd edged my way to the front door when he approached me, offering me the cardboard box ceremoniously. I grabbed the thing quickly and gave a fake smile in return. "So sorry," I said. "I just forgot what day it was." Mr. Myers chuckled. "No need to apologize. We'll see you again soon, no?" Yes," I mumbled, trying not to stutter, hurrying out the front door. I walked briskly to my car, ripped off the eye patch, and reversed out of the driveway like a lunatic. I threw one last glance at the house. The three of them were standing in the doorway smiling, waving energetically in my direction. It's been 5 hours since I got home. The first thing I did was sit down with a bottle of wine, just staring at the box. It took me 2 hours and 2 more bottles to muster up the courage to open it. It contained only one thing, one single item, but it immediately sent shivers down my spine. An artificial eye. The thing is, it looks exactly like my eyes, same color and everything. And I don't know what's going on with my left eye. It's been itching something terrible, and it feels swollen and sore. And sometimes, I swear I can feel something moving behind it. I used to clean houses for a living. This is why I quit. When your job entails cleaning up other people's shit, you're bound to find yourself in some less than stellar situations down the line. In my book, it's inevitable. Over the years, I've lost count of all the weird encounters I've had with clients, and while most of them are innocent in nature, more awkward than anything else, some of them truly leave a bad taste in your mouth. Examples of the latter ranges from some slightly questionable stuff, like mopping up used needles, finding handguns strapped under furniture, uncovering small bags of white powder and pills, to more sinister implications, like bloodstains in the sink, tattered clothes that doesn't seem to quite belong, hearing hoarse whispers behind locked cellar doors. It's never quite enough for you to risk losing your job over, though. The clients demand complete secrecy. That's why they pay us through the roof. All that changed when I started working Lizzie Batten's house, however. You see, for particularly demanding clients, there would never be more than a single cleaner assigned. This was to ensure that the client's demands were met to a satisfactory degree. These demands could be anything from at what time we'd show up to which specific rooms or areas we were meant to clean. But sometimes there'd be more bizarre demands, like what equipment they wanted us to use, or insisting that we'd only walk around barefooted. One client even insisted we'd only enter the house blindfolded. You can imagine the time it took to properly clean his $1 million estate. Yet none of these compare to Lizzie Batten. When I first got the assignment, I had to spend several days memorizing her many requests. I was the 4th cleaner she'd gone through in a month, and I didn't want to risk losing the contract by forgetting one of her strange rules. I tried asking my boss what happened to the other 3 cleaners, but he just shrugged and said they'd quit. Not just the contract, they'd left the company. I found that hard to believe, but the Batten contract just paid far too well for me to continue my inquiries. We never met Ms. Batten, which in hindsight was yet another sign something was off with the whole deal. Usually, the client would either come to our office to detail the nature of the work, or we'd meet up at their house and go through the do's and don'ts. In Batten's case, we only met briefly with her lawyer, a lanky figure who didn't go into details at all. He simply delivered a list of instructions and went on his merry way. The instructions were plentiful and strange, most of them having to do with what we shouldn't do. We weren't allowed in any locked rooms, yet we were given keys to every room as far as I know. Under no circumstances should we enter the master bedroom or the bathroom on the main floor, even if they were unlocked and wide open. If we ever heard unidentifiable sounds, regardless of where they were coming from or what they sounded like, we should immediately drop everything and get out of there post-haste. The cleaning itself had to happen between 9 p.m. and 11:59 p.m., and we should never be in the house after midnight. Now, these rules might sound pretty ominous, bordering on sinister for outsiders, but believe me, I've seen weirder. Our clients were strange and enjoyed being strange. They just didn't want other people to know they were strange. Hence the need to sign multiple documents to ensure that we never talked about what we encountered. Lizzie Batten never had us sign anything. She obviously didn't care what people thought, which I have to admit I found slightly unnerving. The kind of people who hired us always had something to hide. My first couple of shifts at the house went by without any noteworthy incidents. It was a fairly large property, but the majority of the rooms were more often than not locked, so the actual cleaning didn't take me more than a couple of hours. But for every new shift after the initial 2 or 3, I would find a new door unlocked. This would keep happening until finally every room was made available to me, and I had to really step up my game to get everything done before midnight. The house itself was quite spacious, yet comfortable and nice, with warm, unpainted wooden panels in just about every room. Fine paintings adorned the walls, and the many shelves were stacked with books and framed photos, some black and white, some in color. If I were to guess, I'd say they covered a time span of about 60 years or so. What struck me as strange, though, was that the same woman appeared to be in all of them, Lizzie, I wagered, but she looked exactly the same, like she hadn't aged a day. The second thing that I found strange was the lack of dust or dirt. Everything was spotless. Well, except for the flies. For some reason there were flies everywhere, and their corpses littered the windowsills. I spent the first couple of shifts trying to ascertain where they were coming from, but I could never figure it out. They did seem to grow in numbers around the main hall, though, but there were only 2 rooms I hadn't ruled out: the master bedroom and the bathroom. After a couple of weeks, I'd start hearing the sounds, usually around 10 to 11 p.m. Sometimes they'd be really faint, other times quite loud. There'd be creaking in wood, sometimes a low-pitched static buzz, or the sound of a door slowly opening. But the most unnerving would be the voices. I never stuck around long enough to identify where they came from, but they creeped me the hell out. Usually there'd be inaudible murmurs and whispers, but every once in a while they'd be loud enough to make out words. They didn't make any sense to me, however. Words like gentacular or valetudinarian or zerts. Nonsense, right? When these things happened, I'd drop everything in my hands and bolt out the door. To be quite honest, I can't tell you why. I know it was written quite explicitly in the contract, but somehow I think it went deeper than that. It was like I could feel that something wasn't right, that I'd be in danger if I stuck around. I'd been on the job for a little over 2 months when it finally happened. I guess it was inevitable. Nothing lasts forever. 2 months without ever breaking a single rule, and then I just went and broke them all in one night. I don't think it could have been avoided, to be honest. It was always meant to be. It was a night like any other. I'd almost finished all the rooms, having only the main hall left, when I saw her. Lizzie Batten. She was standing in the doorway of the master bedroom, just staring at me silently. She had long, flowing dark hair and smooth, milky white skin. Her gaze glimmered an emerald green, and an eerie grin rested on her rosy lips. Startled by the sight, I stumbled back clumsily and fell over a coat rack. Sprawling on the floor like a fish out of water, I heard a chilling laughter echo through the house. It was light-hearted, almost like a girlish giggle, but it still sent shivers down my spine. "I am so glad you decided to join me tonight," Lizzie said. "You always leave before the fun." I managed to stagger to my feet, facing Lizzie as she edged closer to me. She wasn't naked, but it wasn't far from it. Her nightgown didn't do a very good job of obfuscating her rather attractive physique, and I did an even poorer job of hiding the fact that I was ogling her like a hormonal teenage boy. "I am sorry, Miss Batten. I didn't mean to disturb you." "Nonsense," she smiled warmly. "I was hoping for some company. It's the first of the month, after all." I was sort of clinging to the walls like a scared animal, while her elegant frame inched ever closer. She was beautiful, no doubt about it, but there was something about her, something primal and fierce, something wild and aggressive, something that reached into the very core of my limbic system and rang every alarm bell there was. I realized then that I had to get the hell out of there, but just as I was about to make a run for it, she grabbed my arm. "Will you take a bath with me?" she asked gently. "I have prepared the most wonderful solution for us." She yanked my arm and started walking towards the bathroom. I was pulled behind her like a dog on a leash, and at this point, I don't think I had a choice. She had me under her spell. She opened the door and motioned for me to enter first. The room was pitch black, and I could hardly see an inch before me. "Straight ahead," she said calmly. "Just take off your clothes, and I will guide you." I tried to resist the urge with every fiber in my being. I swear I really did, but I couldn't help myself. Soon enough, I stood there naked, bewildered, lost in Lizzie's trance. She grabbed my hand again, and I could hear her getting into the bath, but it didn't sound right. I don't know quite how to explain it, but the noise was too thick somehow. It was then I noticed it. How could I have ignored it? The smell. My God, the smell. It was like a slaughterhouse in summer, like a mixture of rot and heat and coagulating blood. She yanked my hand again, this time hard enough for me to lose my footing, and I dived headfirst into the awaiting unknown. I'm not sure what was worse, Lizzie's insane laughter, or the initial shock of slowly realizing what exactly filled up that bath. I panicked, I don't mind admitting, and I waved my arms and feet feverishly, somehow convinced that it would help me. "Feels wonderful, doesn't it?" She giggled maniacally. "It's heaven for your skin. Takes years off of you." I coughed and gagged, the horrid sensation completely encompassing my body. It was slippery, extremely slippery, and I struggled frantically to get out of the bath, but I kept getting pulled back in by Lizzie. "You need to let them work it," she said. "Let them nibble a little." I felt the maggots crawling in the back of my throat. I guess I must have swallowed a handful as I fell in, and the taste was like death itself. I'm not sure how I can properly describe the feeling of a million worms crawling all over your body, but I can assure you it isn't pleasant. They were in every crevice, every little nook and cranny, and I could feel their tiny mandibles scratching away at my skin and squishing into hideous, nauseating pulps under the weight of my body. The sound of them slithering, crawling, twisting, squelching still haunts my nightmares to this day. "An hour or two," Lizzie laughed. "That should do it." Suffice to say, I didn't stick around for an hour or two. Somehow I was able to find my footing and kicked myself out of the bath, slipping and sliding my way out of the bathroom on the squished corpses of 100 maggots. I ran naked out into the night, crying and begging and wailing, accompanied by the haunting, chilling, insane laughter of Lizzie Batten. The police found me in a ditch the next day. They couldn't get me to talk. I still don't talk. Now I just sit here, remembering every moment of that night. I hear Lizzie laughing. I smell the bathroom. I can picture the hideous maggot-filled bath. I feel the worms squirming all over my body, and I can taste death in the back of my mouth. And that's why I quit cleaning houses for a living.